Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways that we can advance the cause of Christ among Free Will Baptists around the world. Today, we have here with us Dr. Rusty Russell. He is the senior pastor at Peace Church there in Wilson, North Carolina. Rusty went to Welch College back when it was Free Will Baptist Bible College. He's also a fellow Blue Raider. He got a master's degree from Middle Tennessee State University, an MDiv from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and also a DMin from there. And so Dr. Russell has been there at the Peace Church since 1993, Rusty?
Right.
And then you've been the senior pastor since 2006. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, my friend. We appreciate you joining us today on the Better Together podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks, Ed.
Well, Rusty, I knew your pastor. I was at Bethel Church in Kinston, and he was friends with David Paramore, who was a longtime pastor, as you know, there at Bethel Free Will Baptist Church in Kinston, North Carolina. He followed your pastor, Brother Gordon, to Hookerton, and then ended up going to Bethel. And a couple of years ago, I guess it was 10 years ago now, you might remember I visited your church, and I think I talked about depression. And before we did that, I sat down with Brother Gordon, and he just told his life story. And what a story it was. But all during that time, you worked with him. You'd already worked with him for many years. We'll put that podcast out where people can listen to Brother Gordon tell his story. But like from your perspective as a younger person at that time coming along, what do you see as kind of the keys to Brother Gordon's success at that time?
Wow. I think, and you'll hear this on the podcast, he decided to stay in a place and to tough it out and to make good friends. And I spoke about this some time ago and just talked about how he would even go on vacation with people in the church, which is, that's hardcore right there.
Yeah.
And he really connected. And then I think the other thing, Eddie, is I can just call out name after name of people he personally led to Christ who are in this church and are still here today.
Wow.
And so he just had a huge impact on the city.
That is great. And at some point, I don't know if he wrote this or mentioned it, but he talked about what the church was like when he went there. And one of the things that happened, it was during this time period that he could walk into a restaurant and the mayor would be there and the mayor knew who he was. And it was not a bragging thing, but it was showing the impact of his impact and the church's impact upon the community.
Yes, that's true. And he's had that kind of impact throughout the community.
That is great. And so we do encourage folks to listen to that podcast. And he said that he was always a guy that was about moving and just busy going places, but he could measure his pastorates in months before he went to Peace. And I believe he pastored for 40 years.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So it's one thing to go and to pastor and have a great ministry. You know, Rusty, as well as I do, that you'll see a lot of great men like that. After they retire, they go off the scene. Sometimes the wheels come off.
Right.
The wheels did not come off at Peace. And, you became the senior pastor after him. But how did it set up where you guys hit the accelerator even after that?
Well, I think it's Gordon would always say that he had a dream team. He assembled a group of guys to work with him here. And it's not me. I don't say that about myself, but there were some guys that were on that team. One was his son, Tony, and then Scott Vale. And he had put together, Brian Tippett, he had put together a group of guys that he had a lot of trust in, that had built a lot of trust in him. So really the church began to really rely on that staff as much as they did Brother Gordon. So he was able to just step away and turn it over.
Excellent. And so what you're saying is discipleship is really the main focus there at Peace Church. Already in those days, he was kind of discipling the staff The
Absolutely.
staff were discipling other people. And
Yeah.
so this dream team, if you will, that was assembled was able to really carry on after he left.
Right. And he put a lot of trust in him. He didn't have to have the spotlight. He let these guys develop different things in their ministries and excel. And he just kind of would, especially in the latter part of his ministry, he would just sit back and cheerlead and celebrate. And really it was great the way he did that.
Yeah. So sometime we had talked about that, how you add staff, and you have a need. As the church continues to grow, you're able to, you see what the need is and you find a person that can meet that. And what you're saying is those staff were strong. They had their own personality. I think he would say he had a sanguine personality.
Yeah.
And so you've kind of got someone to meet each particular area within the church.
That's right. And the thing about Brother Gordon was he loved relationships. And so he would show up at your door and say, it's time to go get coffee. And he just wanted to go sit and talk.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so driven that he didn't have to drive us. It's a weird thing. We wanted to do well just because of who he was and just the influence he had. And he did turn into a real disciple or mentor.
Mm-hmm. Somebody may be listening and saying, well, my church is small. I really can't do those kinds of things. But he was also doing it with lay people. Yes. And that's where we can concentrate on looking where everyone's gifts are, trying to pour into them, spending that time with them, helping them to become what they should become.
Absolutely. That's the whole essence of discipleship, really.
Uh-huh.
Relational.
Yes. And then it impacts their family. It impacts your church. It impacts the community, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, if I had to start over, this really came home to me in about 2008 with discipleship, just personally, and pouring into people individually. I don't have time to go into it a lot, Eddie, but I did Evangelism Explosion. I knew how to share the gospel. I could get people to pray with me, but I couldn't find them the next week. Yeah. But with discipleship, I've seen people's lives change, and I can point you to people, and that's what's so cool. And Gordon was doing that without calling it that.
Mm-hmm. Right. He was taking those guys for coffee, talking to them about their lives, and it kind of, you guys became more intentional after he kind of moved off the scene. Right. But it's something they were already kind of primed to do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, churches, pastors retire and, pass away and move away. You've been through a pastoral transition. It seems like it was a long time ago now. Yeah. Walk us through that as well as much as you can. And I think it would be helpful for all of us to kind of listen to how that went down at Peace. And it's good for us to think about whatever setting we're in, how we might be proactive thinking about that so that our church has a better chance of continuing on mission.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking if we got a single pastor here and he doesn't have any kind of a staff, that's a different kind of a issue to transition. And I don't understand that as well. But I think for us, it was it had to be somebody internal for us, because if we'd have brought in someone from the outside to pastor the church, that was a whole different dynamic. It would have meant that they would have to come in and work with a staff that they weren't familiar with. Mm-hmm. So having someone on staff was a huge plus. Mm-hmm. People trusted them and were willing to work through this with me and with others. So that was a big part of it. The other part of it was Gordon, over 40 years, had built up so much trust that when he said, this is the way to go, people were really tuned into that. The other part of it was he talked about it for 5 years before he did it.
That's good.
And he would cheerlead for it. He would celebrate it before it ever happened. So that when it happened, I remember the night they voted, he didn't even ask for negative votes. He just and it was like he didn't mean to do it that way, but he did it that way, and everybody walked out just laughing about it because they were saying, well, that's just Gordon, but he had built so much support for that it was really just a formality.
Yeah.
And it all his trust that he had built among the people.
So he didn't sprinkle it on them. He didn't force it on them either.
No.
He prepared you, and he had prepared them. And in retrospect, like all the deacons, they were, the leadership team was talking about it and kind of working up to it and so forth. And so then by the time it came, it was there.
Yes. So the last year, we preached every other week. We shared the pulpit. I did a lot of preaching on Sunday night. It sort of became organic, I guess is the best way. Like, as he talked with other people, I've heard, vision leaks. Mm-hmm. So as he talked, people were talking about it themselves, and it really wasn't a huge thing when it came.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we're different people. He talks about you are more of an expositor. It was hard for him to kind of sit there and, to do that a little bit. But it worked, and the team was already there, and then it kind of continued on working. So really for something like this to work, people have got to be on the same page, just outsider looking in. People can't be threatened, like you can't have infighting within the other staff. You can't have Brother Gordon like, now people like Rusty's preaching better than mine. None of that. That was such a foreign concept. It really does mean applying like Philippians 2, putting other people's interest and being kind of thoughtful of it.
Yes, it does. And he was very unselfish. Eddie, he stayed after the fact. So until he passed away, I guess that was 15 or 16. I can't remember exactly now. Until he passed away, he would come every Sunday, and he would walk in. And the last, he had moved into this, not a nursing home, but just an assisted living place. And he brought all the guys he watched Andy Griffith with. He would bring them into church. So he and like 3 or 4 others would come into church, and just coming in was a testimony. He just stayed with it even to the end.
And that's another thing. There's probably guys out there like, oh, I hope my guy doesn't hang around. Don't say that out loud, but there could be some folks thinking that. I don't think that was not your feeling about it. And he was an asset, wasn't he?
Right. Absolutely. And he was called a pastoral consultant for his last 10 years he was here. And we did do some consulting, but I think just having him here, and I'll tell you something else I know he did. He didn't tell me about it a lot, but when someone had a complaint, they might go to him.
Yeah.
But he would just kind of grin like he does and just listen and shake his head. And then I think them being able to say it to him and not to me was a big positive.
Yeah. So that's something for older guys. You're thinking about the transition. Can you make that work that way? And I noticed a little thing about him where he just kind of went with the flow. So I came dressed like this from the university to your church. I was wearing a tie, and you guys weren't wearing ties. Brother Gordon wasn't wearing a tie.
Yeah. When
he came back to church, he had a tie on.
Yeah.
But by then, I took my tie off, and he actually took his tie off in church.
Yeah.
He was, whereas other people might be like, I'm the guy, I'm the trendsetter. He was trying to make everything kind of go, didn't want anybody to feel uncomfortable, I guess.
Absolutely.
Picked up on it.
That's true. That's true. He was not threatened. And I guess the one thing I would also say, Eddie, to make it go as smoothly as possible is you have to give it time.
Yeah.
And people have to see it validated, as you have this discussion with your church and you begin to talk about this, they've got to begin to have to transfer that trust from you as their leader to somebody else. And you've got to be okay with that. And you got to be willing to take some time to do it.
I think that as a pastor is the most helpful, because sometimes we feel like we've got to move and, do boom, boom, boom. And what you're saying is he would kind of process it slowly, bring the people along. I think I remember him talking about when you guys moved to the gym. So it was too small in the sanctuary, and it was like a close vote about that initially. And you probably remember that, but he just pulled back, and then they went and talked some more, right? And then brought everybody on board when everybody was okay with it.
Yes. Yeah. And that was a God thing, because really at that time, they didn't need to make that move. There were some things going on that we don't want to go into. And so he stepped back, and he got criticized for stepping back. There were some people who said, wow, we can't believe you gave into that or whatever. But he knew the church, and he knew what we were ready for.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he did it again, though, Eddie, he didn't vote first. He
Okay.
raised the money first.
Okay.
And so he had all these people who had already committed to give to the project. So you really, why were you opposing it now? The money's there. So he was, yeah.
But he slowed it down. He didn't run roughshod over them.
No.
And he kind of made it fairly smooth. And so,
yeah.
So a lot of those guys, he reminds me a lot of David Paramore, and he did mention, they had talked, he followed him at Hookerton and all that. They could deal with people. They could work through conflict.
Yeah.
Talk to us a bit about what you observed with that.
Well, I had a deacon the other night who was in our Sunday evening service. We still have a Sunday evening service. We also have life groups that meet off site. But he said to me, I never forgot what Gordon told me one time. He said, because somebody had really lit into him and just been critical. And he asked him, he said, Brother Gordon, how do you not get angry and bitter over stuff like that? And he said, Gordon told me, he said, as soon as I turn around from them, I forgive them. And I honestly saw that in Gordon. He would not hold a grudge. Life was just too short to hold a grudge. And it didn't matter how you treated him. If people sent him bad mail, he would stick it in a file in his drawer. And then after 6 months or a year, he would just pull it out and read it and laugh about it. I still remember him showing me a letter from somebody that was very critical, and that person's still in our church today, by the way. So he just would let it go and love them. In fact, he had a message where he said, hey, when you ask God to teach you to love, he'll send you somebody that's hard to love.
Yeah.
And he really practiced that.
So, it's important that we learn from these guys from the past. They mentor for you. Someone poured his life and you discipled you. And the same lessons, even though it was a different time, different culture and all that, it's the same biblical principles we need today. Right. So that kind of heart for people, discipling people, training up staff, training up lay people is something we all need to be about. And then as we think about some of the difficulties pastors experience today, we can learn a lot. He just kind of outlasted a lot of the critics, if you will. And it ended up impacting the church and the whole community. And so many others have benefited from what happened there in Wilson, North Carolina.
Absolutely.
Thank you, my friend. We
Yes,
appreciate your time and appreciate you kind of reminiscing with us. And
yeah, it was fun.
It's also something I think that's good, though, for all of us to think, hey, we can do those same kinds of things if we'll put the time in and have the right kind of heart. God can use us too.
Yep, that's true. That's true, Eddie.
And thank you all for joining us today on the Better Together podcast. So we encourage you to take this podcast, share it with others, someone you know that it might be an assist to them. And just remember, as we do work together in the body of Christ, we truly are better together. So let's be faithful as we serve our Lord.